As most of you know, yoga and I do not mix. But from that day forward, it was going to be her personal mission to get me into that studio. And every time I saw her, she asked when I was coming, with a big smile on her face. So one day, out of the blue, I decided to go to her hot yoga studio. When I walked in there, she jumped up, ran around the counter, and gave me a big hug and smile. I will never forget that smile. Kristen Johnson's presence in Halifax had a lasting impact on many people in our community. Her love and openness for the people around her will be missed. Rest in peace, Kristen Johnson.
Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
You want to ask it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, it's been a year now since this government took an axe to our film industry, and 1 year later the results are clear. It's clear that young people have lost their jobs, Mr. Speaker. Many of them are moving away. There is less opportunity for work here, and our economy has suffered a horrible loss. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier now, in light of all of this evidence, does he still believe that the value that the film industry brings to Nova Scotia is less than the cost of the tax credit?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. I want to thank the opportunity to stand up, Mr. Speaker, tell all members of this House. We provide a 25% all-in spend to the film industry in this province, Mr. Speaker, on everything that is purchased in the province of Nova Scotia. I'm very encouraged, Mr. Speaker, to tell this House youth employment is up. Mr. Speaker, the population growth is up in the province, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing the economy move in the right direction. We believe the film industry is an important part of that, Mr. Speaker, and we've shown that by the investment we've made in it, and I look forward to them taking advantage of that fund to make sure that they continue to provide films here in the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there is the problem right there. The Premier knows the cost of things, but he doesn't know the value of anything, Mr. Speaker. We have evidence today from an independent report, the economic assessment of the film and television production industry in Nova Scotia, that shows that the industry actually generates a 7-to-1 return to the province of Nova Scotia, to our economy, Mr. Speaker. $7 in for every $1 that's out. This industry actually pays for itself. It more than pays for itself. It makes money for this government, Mr. Speaker, to pay for important services that we all want to see. More for health care, more for roads, Mr. Speaker. How can the Premier say what he just said? How can he say that and stick to his old line, Mr. Speaker, in the face of evidence that the industry returns $7 for every one that it costs the government?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I'm not sure what the question was, Mr. Speaker, but as I said earlier in my first question, Mr. Speaker, we have a $10 million fund. It's a 25% all-in spend, Mr. Speaker. It's the largest subsidy we make in any sector in the province of Nova Scotia. That is a positive investment. It clearly identifies, Mr. Speaker, the challenge about government is you have to make choices, Mr. Speaker. We believe we've been fair to the film industry. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, creating youth employment jobs in this province, investing in daycare, Mr. Speaker, when it comes forward, investing in classrooms across this province, investing in home care, Mr. Speaker. All of those are the choices that government have to make. He's obviously prepared to make a different one, Mr. Speaker. We're prepared to invest in Nova Scotia that we believe is in an equitable way.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, yes, government is about making choices. You have to make good choices, Mr. Speaker, not bad choices that cost jobs, that cost more when you make them than you need to spend, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and his government cut something that actually pays for itself and pays more than for itself. This industry makes money for the government. That's what the Premier doesn't understand. That's how you pay, Mr. Speaker, for health care, for schools, for roads, by encouraging things that actually return money to the government, 7-to-1 in this case, Mr. Speaker. And besides that, it employs 3,200 young, mobile, educated, creative people, the very people we need more of in this province, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask the Premier to stop being so stubborn and tell us that he'll look at the economic report today and commit to re-examining the bad decision he made when he cut this industry.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe the Leader of the Opposition is suggesting that investing in home care is a bad public policy, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe he's suggesting that investing in public education across this province is a bad public policy. I don't believe, Mr. Speaker, he's suggesting investing in daycare and ensuring that people are paid properly, Mr. Speaker, is bad public policy, Mr. Speaker. Those are the choices we have to make, Mr. Speaker. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we have a 25% all-in spend subsidy, Mr. Speaker, in the film sector.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. His government's proposed changes to seniors' pharmacare created anger and frustration among seniors in Nova Scotia. Many Nova Scotians, myself included, were left scratching their heads when, almost a month after the changes were announced, the Premier told CBC that it was brought to the government's attention that instead of solving the problem, they actually shifted it to another group of seniors who were just over the income threshold. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Premier, is it really his position that neither he nor anyone in his government was aware of the effects of the proposed changes to seniors' pharmacare prior to the rollout?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my position that I listened to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. They clearly identified the challenge that was associated with this program. When they provided us information, it became obvious, Mr. Speaker. Very proud of the fact that many low-income seniors now Mr. Speaker, will have their premiums eliminated. That's a very positive thing, Mr. Speaker. And we'll continue to move forward, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that as we make public policy, that if there's a mistake or an error in it, that, Mr. Speaker, I'll admit that. And we've done that in the seniors program, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, following the Premier's line of reasoning, it seems all the unrest and uncertainty felt by seniors could have been avoided if the government had consulted with somebody or anybody prior to acting with such a heavy hand. My question for the Premier is, why would he allow substantial changes to such an important program be proposed without adequate consultation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to correct the honourable member's question. There was a consultation with Group of 9, Mr. Speaker. There were many opportunities for people to talk about the program, Mr. Speaker, but the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, the reality of it is when seniors get an opportunity to look at the program and the impact that it would have on them individually, many of them very thoughtfully, respectfully, Mr. Speaker, reached out. Told us the experience they were having. It became obvious, Mr. Speaker, that we moved the problem that we were trying to solve for a group of seniors who were having to make very difficult choices about medication and food, and we moved it to another group. That was not our intention, Mr. Speaker, and when it was pointed out to us, I think any reasonable Nova Scotian, any reasonable government would do the right thing and reverse that decision, Mr. Speaker. And what we did was we made sure that we protected the most vulnerable citizens of this province.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians were shocked to learn the Premier had issued a public apology on the proposed changes to seniors' pharmacare using taxpayers' dollars. The Department of Health paid $17,000 for the Premier to apologize for a reckless decision his government made in haste without public consultation. My question for the Premier is, after 2.5 years of nickel and diming groups and organizations across the province, why does he think it's okay to use taxpayers' dollars to apologize for his government's mistake?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the Premier of this province, Mr. Speaker, I represent all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. It became obvious that many seniors across this province, there was no question, the Honourable Member said, there was a level of anxiety, Mr. Speaker. I believe it was my responsibility of government, that we would make sure we communicated directly with seniors. One of those ways was through that ad, Mr. Speaker, to identify, to tell them that what are the changes that would be happening positively, Mr. Speaker. We're asked often, Mr. Speaker, to reach out and communicate with citizens. I can tell you I've not heard from a single senior citizen who was complaining about that, Mr. Speaker. They're grateful for the fact that we listened to them and acted properly.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it is bad public policy to sign a $100 million bad ferry deal. It is bad public policy to reach deep into the pockets of seniors on fixed income with a tax grab through the pharmacare program. And, Mr. Speaker, it is bad public policy to actually cancel an industry that the government makes money off of, Mr. Speaker. The film industry actually helps pay for the public services that we want. That is the bottom line from the report that was issued today independently that the Premier refuses to read. The Premier wants to tell us about governments making choices. How is it good public policy to cut an industry that actually contributes to the economy of the province and makes money for the government at the same time?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind him 25% all-in spend is the largest subsidy in any sector that we make in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to continuing to have that happen, Mr. Speaker, continue to grow, and we look forward to the sector continuing to be here in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the largest subsidy in the history of this province is the $100 million that government signed over to a private company to run a ferry because they couldn't negotiate a good deal for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. We could have 4 film industries for the cost of that bad deal, Mr. Speaker. How the Premier can lecture us on this stuff when that's what he's prepared to sign away is beyond me, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you this. It's time to explain to the 3,200 jobs that are at risk because the Premier is too stubborn to take another look at this industry, why they're cut, but he's prepared to sign away $100 million on a bad ferry deal.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank all members of the South. I want to thank Nova Scotians for continuing to work with our government, Mr. Speaker, to bring it back to fiscal health so we can invest in the things, Mr. Speaker, like quality daycare, Mr. Speaker, ensuring those looking after our children are being properly paid, investing in home care, Mr. Speaker, making sure that the provincial hospital, Mr. Speaker, gets on the path to being in a safe place, Mr. Speaker, to be rebuilt. Mr. Speaker, at the same time allowing us to pay a 25% all-in investment subsidy, Mr. Speaker, in the film industry. As we grow the province, youth employment is up, Mr. Speaker, the population is up. We're seeing positive signs that the province is moving in the right direction, and I want to thank all Nova Scotians for helping us move.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March 27th of last year, here on the floor of this legislature, I asked the Minister of Health and Wellness about funding for seniors' pharmacare. The Minister stood here in this House and made an explicit promise, and he said, and I quote, "What I can tell the member opposite and all Nova Scotians, while I'm Minister of Health and Wellness, there won't be an increase in premiums in seniors' pharmacare," Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health: given this promise to all Nova Scotians last year, why did the Minister propose changes to seniors' pharmacare that would have seen raised premiums for thousands of seniors across Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in the question is the operative word, would have. Today, every senior on the pharmacare program is paying no premium or less or the same as they always did.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Well, I guess he was just teasing the seniors here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's not a way of dealing with seniors and seniors' pharmacare. The Minister failed his failed attempt to sell the proposal and the proposed changes to pharmacare as a good news story to Nova Scotians has caused many Nova Scotians to lose trust in the Minister. The Minister's reluctance to release information following the rollout only added to this mistrust. These events have strengthened the argument, Mr. Speaker, that changes to the seniors' pharmacare should be debated on the floor of the legislature. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister commit to bringing any future proposed changes to seniors' pharmacare to this House for public debate?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand in my place any day and discuss senior pharmacare or any other health issue that impacts on Nova Scotia's lives. What we will now engage in is a wider consultation with seniors and all Nova Scotians on how this program can be shaped for the future. Without an increase this year, the downside, Mr. Speaker, is that we will not be able to add any new medications, any new drugs to the formulary.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's obvious to just about every Nova Scotian this government made a very bad deal when it signed away $100 million to support a boat between Yarmouth and Portland, Mr. Speaker. It's so bad that the private company actually can't lose. Government officials confirm the only way that company can lose money in light of the subsidies from this government is if it's hit by an asteroid, Mr. Speaker. The government itself confirms they didn't do any economic analysis to see whether this deal would be a payback for Nova Scotians or not, Mr. Speaker. I think we're seeing a theme here. Will the Premier admit, finally, these are just political decisions, and he's not even considering whether they're good for jobs and the economy or not?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Transportation to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's rich that the leader would say this is political, Mr. Speaker. He's using a number of $100 million, which is absolutely not true. Not even close, Mr. Speaker. Not even close. The member for Pictou East, you'll get a chance to. Don't worry about it. You'll be up to. So, Mr. Speaker, here's the reality of this. We've signed the best deal that we could with the best operator based on the process.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the best operator that we have, it's not $100 million. That's the political number that the Tories across the way are going to use to try to create this narrative. The reality is we've got a 2-year agreement with Bay Ferries on this vessel, and a 10-year overall agreement, Mr. Speaker. It's the best thing for our province. It's the best thing for the region. We're not giving up on Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker. They want to make this political, Mr. Speaker. They're going down a bad road because we're not giving up on the people of that region. They know it's right. The member from Argyle-Barrington's not saying a word, Mr. Speaker.
Order,
He's hiding
please.
under his chair because
the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's a little rich coming from that side. Mr. Speaker, it's a little
Order,
rich.
please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it's a little rich, that side lecturing us about numbers. After all, one of the main numbers, which is how much the secret management fee is, the government is so embarrassed they won't even tell us how much profit that company is going to make while they underwrite every single dollar of losses, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? The Premier can clear that up right now, Mr. Speaker. He can clear it up right now because Nova Scotia taxpayers, they deserve to know. How much does the government think this is going to cost them over 10 years? If it's not $100 million, tell us how much you've committed us to. That's what they should answer, Mr. Speaker. And tell us how much that company is going to make in secret profits. Get the permission and tell the people commit to that right now.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Nova Scotia has entered into an arrangement with Bay Ferries to provide transportation link, Mr. Speaker, to our largest trading partner, to our largest opportunity when it comes to tourism, Mr. Speaker. This is a program that has been put in place, Mr. Speaker, with an operator that has provided that service before in the past. We're encouraged by the relationship we've been able to build with them. We're encouraged by the work that's coming, Mr. Speaker, and quite frankly, the people of Nova Scotia is encouraged by the fact that they have the Nova Scotia ferry back, Mr. Speaker. We're hearing from tourism operators across the province to see growth, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all of those Nova Scotians who've been patient as we worked our way through this over the last number of months to ensure that we had that service there as they were making investments in their businesses for the coming season.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is such a bad deal. The Premier traded away our opportunities for trade. He traded away trucks, Mr. Speaker. He traded away an opportunity for taxpayers to actually get a break, Mr. Speaker. They traded away any hope that there'll ever be an end to the subsidies for that boat, as all you can see for 10 years is losses after losses, Mr. Speaker. They traded away, in fact, their own financial credibility. The only thing that we have going for us is the schedule and the timing of that boat in Yarmouth on the Nova Scotia side, Mr. Speaker. And now we find out they may not even have that, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier, will he confirm that the schedule that was published the other day will be the schedule that Nova Scotians can rely on and that the people of Yarmouth can rely on for having that boat on our side?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Transportation to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The agreement that's in place was developed over a year between Bay Ferries, the City of Portland, the people that are there making decisions on behalf of the City. Mr. Speaker, the decisions that are before the City of Portland, the decision that's before the City of Portland, Mr. Speaker, is based solely on the agreement.
Order,
that's been put
please. The Honourable Minister of Transportation has the floor.
So, Mr. Speaker, again, this is a process that has to take place through the City of Portland. The councillors and the elected people there get to make this final decision. The pieces have been put together by Mark McDonald Bay Ferries with their colleagues down in Portland. They'll go through that process, Mr. Speaker, and we'll respect their decision when it's made. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me get this straight. We're going to put in $100 million. We're going to run rate every loss short of an asteroid. They get all the jobs. There's no Canadians on that boat, Mr. Speaker. There's no trucks. There'll be no lobsters going across or softwood or anything else, Mr. Speaker. And it's up to the people of Portland who are putting in $0 whether we get the schedule we want or not, Mr. Speaker. Well, that is not good enough. That should all have been worked out when the government was busy putting $100 million on the table of Nova Scotia taxpayers' money. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the plan? In light of all that Nova Scotia taxpayers are being asked to do, what is the plan to ensure that at least we get the sailing schedule that we need?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, we've done absolutely everything we can to get every aspect of this ferry service right, Mr. Speaker. We've gone through a rigorous process. We've had proponents make bids. The best choice by far was Mark MacDonald, a company, a reputable company, a good operator here that party, that government used to support back in 2009, Mr. Speaker. They've had the same relationship and a very similar contract, Mr. Speaker, with Bay Ferries, to the point of $10 million per year was their deal back in 2009, Mr. Speaker. So, look, the reality is, it's not true. Okay. Mr. Speaker, the reality is, this is the reality. We came to the absolute best deal for the people of Yarmouth, for that region, Mr. Speaker. They want to make this their political story. This is what they want to do. They're going to attack the service. They're going to attack Mark MacDonald. We're not giving up, Mr. Speaker, and this is going to work because we put the time in. We've got the best deal and the best operator, and this will be to the benefit of all.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I was so enraptured by that answer that I lost track of where we were. Mr. Speaker, on January the 15th, the government issued a press release which led seniors to believe that they were actually going to get a break on their pharmacare premiums, but that turned out that wasn't the case because for many seniors, Mr. Speaker, they saw increases of up to 200%. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, the government told seniors this was necessary to make the program sustainable. But what the government didn't tell them was that it was taking $10 million of its own money out of the pharmacare program for its own use, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, that's not what a government does when they want to truly make a program sustainable. So my question to the Premier is this. Will he now confirm for our seniors that, in fact, this whole fiasco was simply a tax grab to take money out of seniors' pockets and put it into the coffers of the government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's just a ridiculous question, Mr. Speaker. The program has been there, Mr. Speaker. It's $166 million. All Nova Scotians contribute about $110 million. 54 roughly comes from the premiums that are provided, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister alluded to earlier, the formulary is restricted, Mr. Speaker. This was no windfall for the government of Nova Scotia. We believe in this program. I believe all Nova Scotians believe in this program. The adjustments that were being made, Mr. Speaker, when we realized it was having a negative impact on a group of senior citizens that we had not anticipated, Mr. Speaker, we did the appropriate thing, responded back to that, Mr. Speaker. That program is there. The Minister is going out to do further consultation, to work with seniors across this province to make sure that not only is the program there, that we can expand the formulary to cover the much-needed medication and drugs, Mr. Speaker, that seniors across our province require. But the good news, Mr. Speaker, there are many, many more seniors today paying less on the pharmacare program than they were a year ago, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, if this is such a great thing, why did the Premier trip over himself several times apologizing to seniors for what he did to them? Mr. Speaker, at their expense. Fact of the matter is, seniors were paying more because the government was going to put $10 million less into the program. That actually destabilized it. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, we've heard from premiers all across the province, from seniors all across the province, Mr. Speaker, and they've been very clear. They want the program to be there for them. They want to know they're going to get access to the medicines that they need, and they want the government to know that they are on a fixed income, and you can't keep digging deeper and deeper into their pockets, Mr. Speaker. In addition, they now have under threat given the government their private tax information, and they want it back. Mr. Speaker, I've written to the Premier on this before. Will he take this opportunity today to assure seniors he will destroy the private information that the government got under threat?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to again thank all Nova Scotians who responded, Mr. Speaker, around the pharmacare program. I want to thank them for their patience, their hard work, and Mr. Speaker, telling us their personal story. We responded to that, Mr. Speaker. The information that was required to that, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, that doesn't come to us. It goes to the Revenue Canada. It wouldn't be information that we would get. It would just tell us based on what the premium would be. Any information that would be here would not come to the Department of Health. And what's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, when you get inside of this theatre, people will take information to build up the rhetoric, Mr. Speaker, to put fear in the seniors across this province, Mr. Speaker. And the bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, the bottom line, Mr. Speaker.
Order,
Mr. Speaker,
please.
The Honourable
Premier
Member
has the floor.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member is criticizing me, Mr. Speaker, for apologizing. Is he too big a man to apologize when he's wrong, Mr. Speaker? I think most Nova, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I think most Nova Scotians want the Premier to, Mr. Speaker, to apologize if they believe he's wrong.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. On February 8th, she issued a response to the appeal of Northern Pulp's industrial approval, and in doing so, agreed to increase their allowable water usage significantly up to a maximum of just over 92,000 cubic meters a day, despite the fact that comparable mills in Canada are around 70. And I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, the water availability study that she received for the Granton area, which I will also table, which she received in December, stated that the maximum sustainable water withdrawal is around 95,000 cubic meters. So essentially the Minister has approved an amount very close to that, and that's just one company. Michelin and others also draw from that location. The study also assumes there will be no commercial, industrial or residential development in the future in that watershed of 239 square kilometers. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the Minister agree to such a significant increase when comparable mills can do much better?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. This is my very first question in the room. Thank you. As the honourable member opposite knows, the government has worked very hard these last 2 years to ensure a cleaner and safe operating mill, and to ensure that we support Nova Scotians in their desire for an environmentally healthy and prosperous Pictou County. So we did, as he said, change the numbers on some of the water emissions, but there was a new study done that shown that the amount of water that could be brought into the mill was certainly available through the source, and that it was something that the government and the town and the mill could work with, and so we approved that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you're welcome on the first question, but yes, there's enough water as long as, it says in that study, as long as there is no residential, commercial or industrial development anywhere in a 239 square kilometre area of Pictou County in the future. It states it right in the water usage study that I just tabled. So, Mr. Speaker, the owners of Northern Pulp recently upgraded a BC mill they own to bring down their water usage to 68,000. But here, the Minister has decided that measures expected in mills in BC, Quebec and Alberta don't need to apply in Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, this also makes the effluent plant the province has to build much more expensive. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister explain why residents in Nova Scotia, and Pictou County in particular, deserve less scrutiny on their water usage in their watershed than do residents in British Columbia, Alberta and Quebec?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. I certainly can't speak to what's happening in other areas. You know, we looked at all the information that we had. The department has worked very good to come up with a solution for Northern Pulp. The studies were done that showed that this water was available for the use. The effluent levels would be at an acceptable level, and we approved that measure.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, as we've all heard earlier here in the House and also in a CBC interview today, the Premier continues to demonstrate an unwillingness to accept that before his government recklessly axed the film tax credit, the Nova Scotia's film industry actually provided a net economic benefit to the province. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Today, Screen Nova Scotia posted highlights of a new report prepared by PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the world's leading independent accounting firms, which concluded that Nova Scotia's screen industry, as it operated under the film tax credit, did in fact provide a clear economic benefit to the province. And I will also table that, Mr. Speaker.
Does the member have a question?
The study reports, Mr. Speaker,
Does the member have a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As the study reports, the film industry did provide many jobs.
Order, please. We'll move into the supplementary time for the member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Question for the Premier is, what evidence can he provide that would suggest that he is in fact correct, while one of the world's leading independent accounting firms is wrong?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, there's a $10 million fund that is there that is 25% all-in spend grant, Mr. Speaker, to program to films that are in the province. That is a tremendous investment. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that her numbers she using, Mr. Speaker, are accurate. That means that $10 million was a good investment by this government. We're looking forward to seeing the return and the revenue on that $10 million, Mr. Speaker. We have to make choices, Mr. Speaker. We've invested $65 million back in the classrooms that she was a member of a government that cut out, Mr. Speaker. We've invested $44 million. We've invested $44 million, Mr. Speaker, in home care. We're going to do more, Mr. Speaker. When the Minister of Finance stands up, we're going to invest in child care, Mr. Speaker, in daycare and daycare workers, a thing that they ignored, Mr. Speaker, while in government, Mr. Speaker. It's a balance. We believe we're being fair to all Nova Scotians. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, youth employment is up, Mr. Speaker. Population is up, Mr. Speaker. And we're seeing the economy grow, Mr. Speaker, in a positive way.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Arcadia Entertainment has been in business for 15 years, providing good, full-time, permanent jobs. But because of this Liberal government's short-sighted policy, Arcadia, a Nova Scotia success story, is now in jeopardy. And staff at Arcadia remember full well when the Premier campaigned for their votes, promising to extend the tax credit, when this government passed a bill to extend the tax credit and then swiped it away. It was a swipe of the pen. So my question for the minister is, what can the minister tell the good folks of the film industry what information he relied on when the department got rid of the film tax credit?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been noted by the Premier to previous questions earlier today and for the past little while, Mr. Speaker, governing is about making choices. And what we've done, we continue to recognize the support the industry, Mr. Speaker. We've established a fund for $10 million, Mr. Speaker, for the investment into the programs. That's operated, Mr. Speaker, under Nova Scotia Business Inc., which falls under the purview of the Minister of Business. So, Mr. Speaker, we're still investing in the industry. Look forward to the returns that the industry provides. And, Mr. Speaker, we continue to make investments in other priority services for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is reporting to us that actual revenue is way, way, way below projected revenue. Part of that hole is probably because of what they did to the film tax industry and to the film industry. And I'm asking what information the department relied on. And I think we heard the answer. Nothing, except for a matrix that asked bureaucrats to give information about whether decisions would have political implications. And one of the things they wanted bureaucrats to say was, would the expected outcry and responses be manageable? And they wanted bureaucrats to rank that as political sensitivity, high, moderate, low. I'd like to ask the minister, how did the bureaucrats rank the political sensitivity on this decision? High, low, or moderate?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, for the film industry and the role that's going on, Mr. Speaker, we no longer have a film tax credit, Mr. Speaker. We have a fund with $10 million investment, Mr. Speaker, for individual applications that come forward, Mr. Speaker. That fund will provide rebate, Mr. Speaker, available for eligible applicants, upwards of 25 to almost 30%, Mr. Speaker, to support all in Nova Scotia spend, Mr. Speaker. That's supporting not just the people directly in the film industry, Mr. Speaker, but supporting the spend out in the community, Mr. Speaker, returning into people with restaurants, tourism sector, Mr. Speaker, accommodations, Mr. Speaker. All of those are being supported by the new grant, Mr. Speaker. This is good for Nova Scotians, and Mr. Speaker, it's also fiscally responsible, the approach that we've taken here, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I think this is an annual event that I asked the Minister of Health about the update on the hospice. As the Minister knows, and we know from the Annapolis Valley, the fundraising for the hospice in the Annapolis Valley has been completed now for a couple of years, and we want to know when the announcement will be, and can he tell me and the citizens of the Annapolis Valley when will the announcement be for the build on the hospice in the Annapolis Valley?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I'm pleased to say today is that our government is committed to hospice. There are no hospice in our province. We have worked out a framework that will allow communities in the future to be able to have hospice. We know that the MOU process is currently underway and negotiating with two communities as we speak.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. I'm not sure I'm really that pleased with that answer. I know that the Minister has said in the past that the announcement, several times in the past, the announcement would be very soon. I didn't hear that right now. I know that if I was to be told that I did not have long to live, that I would want to hear that from the Minister, that I would pass away very soon, because I would think I could be confident that it would last a couple of years. But, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is this: what does he have to say to the citizens of Valley who gave $8 million to this fundraising campaign, and we see the value of that money continue to erode as inflation eats away at that, as construction costs continue to rise? What does he have to say to the donors of that money from his constituency and from mine about that?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad the member opposite is in good health, because we do have a little ways to go. This was a very difficult file. When I became Minister of Health and started to talk about palliative care in the province, in fact, we had absolutely very little direction in the department. There was no framework for envisioning how palliative care would be done across Nova Scotia. We now have a palliative care coordinator. We have a framework in place, and over the next little while, those MOUs will be finalized. And I certainly look forward to the day when I invite the member opposite to an announcement.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musquedominant Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Gravel roads make up about 1/3 of the road infrastructure in my constituency. I know I've received many complaints in the past few weeks, and I've actually traveled to see the basis for those complaints. The potholes are so bad you have to drive about 5 kilometers an hour just to get through them. And in some places, the only way to get through is with a truck or an SUV. My question is, what is the status of the work to be done on gravel roads this year?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that question was planted by some members of my own caucus with respect to gravel roads. Mr. Speaker, the situation with gravel roads varies from year to year. This has been a tough one, there's no doubt about it. In all seriousness, for all regions, many communities have been struggling with gravel roads. The reality is, with the precipitation and with the spring thaw, some years are just tougher than others. This is a particularly tough one for us, and really what we do now, we look at what's passable and what isn't, and we really react from the depots, from the individual stations across the province that TIR operates to get there and make sure that for emergency purposes, for urgent situations, we get them open, Mr. Speaker. We can't really get our equipment in to do a whole lot of work because of the weight restrictions, and of course, it's tough to even drop gravel this time of year. So it really is a case-by-case basis, and as always, to the member, if there's anything specific that we can bring forward, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musquedominant Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and you're absolutely right. There isn't an MLA here who wouldn't have written that question, I'm sure. Is there any plan for a capital project to start bringing these roads to a reasonable standard?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very good question, very fair question. We actually are looking at that opportunity. As the member knows, if a lot of the gravel work, brush cutting, other annual maintenance is done through an operational envelope. So if it was capitalized, that would certainly give us additional opportunities to address at least the most pressing roads with respect to gravel. So we are looking at that and doing some of the numbers and seeing what we can do. And obviously, with the weather and with the way that the season has turned out, there is a merit for looking at that. So we will certainly do so. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, yesterday the announcement was made to close 17 schools in Cape Breton. This is devastating news for the families and communities that will be directly affected by these closures. 2 of the schools were built using the P3 model, and as the NDP has said many times, the P3 process is fiscally irresponsible. This government invested more than $2 million in contract payments for those 2 schools this year alone, and these assets paid by the people of Nova Scotia will now be handed over lock, stock and barrel to private developers. So my question for the Minister of Education is, why is the Minister allowing private developers to take public assets that were paid for by the hard-working people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. And I would like to begin by congratulating the communities in Cape Breton who have wrestled with and made some very tough decisions, but they made them in the best interest of the students. As every member in the House knows, school reviews have for a long time and will continue to be emotional activities for communities to go through. We believe that the changes that were made in the school review process have allowed things like the Cape Breton decision to be more acceptable because the community are part of the decision making. So I'm very proud of the work the folks in Cape Breton did, and I'm very pleased to know that they are looking forward to how they can provide facilities that provide quality programs for their kids.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for her answer, and I'd like to also say that, as far as I'm concerned, the communities that she's referring to are actually placed between a rock and a hard place when they have to make these decisions. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia needs strong schools in strong communities. Schools provide the essential building blocks for a prosperous and healthy province. We need robust leadership from government. And just this morning, in a radio interview, the Premier acknowledged that education is a priority issue for Nova Scotians. Well, with more than 30 P3 schools in the province and decision notices on some imminent, my question for the Minister of Education is this. Will the Minister tell Nova Scotians how she plans to address the fiscally irresponsible and reckless situation created by the P3 school contracts?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to respond to the first part of the question, I'd like to remind everyone in the House that it's not the mortar and bricks that make a school, it's what takes place in the classroom. As for the P3 decisions, there was a decision made by a previous government to provide quality buildings in communities. That was the decision of the government of the day. We are now moving forward with how do we look at providing quality buildings, but more importantly, quality education in the classroom.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question is for the Minister of Health. Families in Pictou County continue to be left in the dark concerning the future of the short-stay mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital. What was intended to be a temporary closure now appears to be indefinite, and families continue to suffer. My question to the Minister, will the Minister finally be upfront and tell the people of Pictou County what will become of the short-stay mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my understanding that the 3 MLAs that represent Pictou County have had a meeting and information provided about mental health services in Pictou County, and what I can assure the member opposite who just presented the question, and all people of Pictou County, that mental health services are stronger today than what they were 1 year ago.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, constituents that come to my office certainly would not agree with that last statement by the minister. Mr. Speaker, we have learned that this government used a chart to gauge the reaction to cutting certain programs. Among the things considered under handy chart is the effectiveness of a program in political considerations. My question to the, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister: what was the expected public outcry to closing the short-stay unit at the Aberdeen Hospital, and did the minister feel that the negative socio-economic impacts could be minimized or managed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think what the member has become aware of, and all probably people now in Pictou County, is that what was a short-term mental health unit was not one that met the standards for Nova Scotia short-term mental health unit. What is happening now with the refurbishing of the ER in Aberdeen is that there will be 2 beds to provide observation of those who come in any kind of mental health trauma.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Hi there. Sorry, I thought we were almost run out of time there. My question through you is also to the Minister of Health, and it revolves around the information that we have within our electronic medical records. A business owner in Bedford alerted the media last week after years of trying to stop sensitive material or sensitive mental health records from being incorrectly sent to her office. The information was intended for a mental health referral office and included not only patient names but private information concerning their mental health. The owner estimates that she receives dozens of faxes containing private patient information over the years. So my question to the minister: what action has the minister taken to fix this serious breach of Nova Scotia private medical information, and will he assure the House that it is the only instance of this happening?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what we're all aware of is that this had gone on for a considerable period of time, about 10 years. In fact, I believe the member opposite was also Minister of Health while this unfortunate incident had happened. We have moved very quickly with the Nova Scotia Health Authority and with the privacy officer to investigate and make that very, very simple correction around getting a fax number correct. It really is a very simple solution here. I know that our records, we have much data collected on people in the Department of Health and Wellness, and therefore we asked as well a third party to look into this issue.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And nothing should prevent Nova Scotians from seeking the help that they need, especially the mental health treatments that they require. And shaken by the confidence in the privacy of their private and medical information should dissuade someone from seeking the care that they need. I mean, they shouldn't be worried about their files being faxed willy-nilly around the province. Failure to protect private medical information goes against the Personal Health Information Act, which provides penalties for these kinds of breaches. So despite pointing to the health authority and doctors, and ultimately the minister is accountable to this one. So will the minister assure all Nova Scotians that their private mental health records and health records in general will not improperly be distributed again?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And one of the aspects that I conveyed very strongly when interviewed by media was that I was truly disturbed by this incident, and we moved very, very quickly to hopefully have corrected once and for all in this particular instance. But it does cause me as Minister to take a look at how the transmission of very private information takes place in this province. I know we are the custodians of tremendous amounts of private information about Nova Scotians, and we certainly give it the highest regard in terms of its secrecy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia. Since the last fall setting, the Minister has made public the fact that his department has spent over $800,000 on consultants in legal fees regarding potential privatization of the registries. This amount is substantial, Mr. Speaker, especially given the department has also made public that for $2 to $3 million, the land registry system could be upgraded. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, and I think taxpayers deserve to know, what costly advice has been provided to the Minister by these high-paid consultants?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work that's been undertaken in Service Nova Scotia has been very thorough to ensure that all options that government could pursue have been considered. That takes inherently a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of time and equally associated costs. We don't have all of that subject matter expertise within government, Mr. Speaker. We truly wanted an independent response, and we believe we've received that, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As is customary when we start a session, there is no government business. As a Bill 149 was introduced today, it will be ready for debate tomorrow. In light of the fact that we're scheduled to sit today till 6 p.m. and the fact that due to the election of Speaker and other speeches earlier today, by my calculations, only 18 member statements were actually read. So in light of that, knowing it's the opening day and everyone has lots of member statements they'd love to make, I would ask you to seek the unanimous consent of the House to revert back to the order of business member statements.